The civilian repeated his name with a calm certainty that made Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald set down his checker piece and look up. "Lindbergh," the man said again. Charles Lindbergh, the Charles Lindbergh, America's most celebrated aviator, the man who had once crossed the Atlantic alone, was standing there in a makeshift recreation hut in the sweltering humidity of Hollandia, New Guinea. Outside, the sound of P-38 engines rolled across the airfield like distant thunder. Inside, cigarette smoke drifted through shafts of sunlight cutting across the room. Lindbergh asked, almost softly, for permission to discuss P-38 combat operations. It seemed like a small request at the time, but that moment, that quiet, almost casual conversation between a civilian and a war-weary officer, would alter the future of long-range fighter operations in the Pacific Theater. Over the next 6 weeks, Lindbergh would do what no one had thought possible. His methods, grounded in mathematics and experience rather than rank or doctrine, would stretch the combat radius of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning by nearly 400 miles. It would redefine the limits of the aircraft, the pilots, and perhaps even the concept of what was possible. This was not simply a story about engines or numbers. It was the story of a man who taught soldiers to trust logic over instinct, and of how that quiet defiance of convention changed the war in the Pacific. The idea that range could be extended not through technology, but through understanding, was almost heretical. The P-38's limitations had been accepted facts of engineering. Yet Lindbergh saw beyond that. He believed that range, true range, was a matter of precision, of listening to the engines the way a musician listens to the tempo of a score. What he taught over those 6 weeks would rewrite not the manuals, but the mindset of fighter aviation. And the teacher was a 42-year-old civilian who had never even touched a P-38 until 3 days earlier. To understand how Lindbergh arrived at that weather-beaten hut in Hollandia, we have to go back 17 years, to the wide, gray sky over the Atlantic Ocean. On May 20th, 1927, a young pilot named Charles Augustus Lindbergh took off from Roosevelt Field, Long Island, in a custom-built Ryan monoplane called the Spirit of St. Louis. It carried 450 gallons of fuel, so much that the tanks completely blocked his forward view. For 33.5 hours, he flew alone through storms, fog, and fatigue, navigating not by instruments, but by intuition, by stars, by compass, by the faint feeling of direction in his bones. When he finally touched down at Le Bourget airfield in Paris, he had crossed 3,600 miles of ocean and landed with 85 gallons of fuel still in his tanks. He had achieved an efficiency no engineer thought possible for that right whirlwind radial engine. That obsessive precision, that refusal to waste even. A drop of fuel became his hallmark, a science of efficiency that bordered on art. Throughout the 1930s, Lindbergh flew survey routes for Pan American Airways, charting new airways across the Pacific and the Atlantic. He studied engine behavior the way a watchmaker studies gears, searching for the point where power, speed, and endurance met imperfect balance. He knew that the numbers in manufacturer manuals were only averages, not limits. Every engine, he realized, had its own rhythm, a sweet spot of pressure, RPM, and mixture where the machine truly came alive. By 1944, that mastery had made Lindbergh one of the world's foremost experts on long-range flight. But his relationship with the United States military was complicated. Before the war, Lindbergh had been the voice of isolationism, urging America to stay out of Europe's conflicts. He had led rallies for the America First Committee, earning both admiration and condemnation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt despised him. When Roosevelt publicly likened Lindbergh to Confederate sympathizer Clement Vallandigham in 1941, Lindbergh resigned his Air Corps Reserve Commission in protest. Then came Pearl Harbor. When America entered the war, Lindbergh tried to return to service, but Roosevelt made sure that would never happen. The order was clear. Charles Lindbergh would never again wear an American uniform. Yet war has a way of bending rules when skill becomes necessity. Barred from active duty, Lindbergh became a civilian consultant for aircraft manufacturers. He joined United Aircraft Corporation in 1943, working closely with Chance Vought, the makers of the F-4U Corsair. He tested aircraft, analyzed engines, and even helped improve dive-bombing techniques. He flew Thunderbolts at high altitude to evaluate performance limits, and he walked factory floors at Ford's Willow Run, troubleshooting production issues on B-24 Liberators. His expertise was irreplaceable, but his heart still ached for the airfields of combat, for the hum of propellers on the edge of war. By early 1944, he found a way. United Aircraft wanted to study the operational limits of a twin-engine fighter under real combat conditions. The only such American plane in active service was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Lindbergh convinced them, with quiet persistence, to send him to the Pacific as a technical observer. On April 3, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for deployment. He bought a naval officer's uniform from Brooks Brothers, no insignia, no rank. At Brentano's bookstore, he picked up a small New Testament. "Since I can only carry one book," he wrote in his journal, "and a very small one, that is my choice." It was not the book he would have chosen a decade earlier, he noted, but the more he learned, the less competition it has. He left San Diego on April 24th, officially bound for Marine aviation bases in the South Pacific, an assignment authorized by the Navy, but kept secret from the White House. Neither President Roosevelt nor Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had any idea the nation's most controversial aviator was headed into a war zone. When Lindbergh arrived, the Marines greeted him with skepticism. A civilian in the war zone was an anomaly, a risk. But it took only one mission for them to see who he really was. On May 21, 1944, Lindbergh flew his first combat sortie with Marine Fighting Squadron 222, a strafing run over the heavily fortified Japanese garrison at Rabaul. Officially, he was there as an observer. Unofficially, his guns were armed. When opportunity came, he engaged. The Marines called it observation. Lindbergh called it learning. But what they all saw was extraordinary. He analyzed the F-4U Corsair's performance like a surgeon studying a heartbeat. Within days, he was teaching pilots how to safely take off with bomb loads, double the aircraft's rated capacity, a feat thought impossible. The key was precision. He adjusted throttle settings, takeoff speeds, and power curves to find the balance that would lift the heavy birds without stalling. His calculations worked. The Marines, who had lost planes to overweight crashes, suddenly found themselves striking deeper targets with confidence. Word spread quickly through the islands. The man who had once crossed the Atlantic alone was now flying combat missions, a civilian doing what officers wouldn't dare. His presence became a strange symbol of the war's contradictions, banned from wearing the uniform, yet fighting alongside those who did. By mid-June 1944, Lindbergh's fascination turned toward the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft's technical interests provided the pretext, but for Lindbergh, it was something deeper. The Lightning, sleek, twin-boomed, and fiercely elegant, represented the kind of aircraft that spoke to his engineer's soul. He heard whispers about the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, one of the most formidable Lightning squadrons in the Pacific. If he wanted to understand the P-38, that was where he needed to go. On June 15th, he hitched a ride to Nadzab, New Guinea, then continued onward to Hollandia. There, amid a tangle of airstrips and jungle, he introduced himself to the 5th Air Force Command. He met with Colonel Marion Cooper, and later that week, dined with General Ennis Whitehead to discuss operations. Nothing was formal. No official orders, no rank. In the fluid chaos of the Pacific Theater, competence spoke louder than paperwork. On June 20th, he took the controls of a P-38 for the first time. For an hour and 20 minutes, he tested her, feeling the torque, the vibration of the twin Allison engines, the way she responded to touch. To anyone watching, it was just another checkout flight. But to Lindbergh, it was communion, man and machine finding rhythm. 6 days later, he walked unannounced into a room where Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald, the young ace of the 475th, was, playing checkers. The meeting was almost cinematic in its simplicity. One man bent over a game board, another standing in the doorway with history behind him. MacDonald was 29, already a legend, commander of a unit that had carved its name into Pacific skies. And here stood Lindbergh, the pioneer, the exile, the teacher, asking humbly for permission to help. The conversation that followed would ripple through history. Lindbergh began to share what he knew, how power settings, propeller pitch, and mixture ratios could stretch a fighter's endurance far beyond expectation. Pilots listened, curious but skeptical. Yet, as the days passed and they flew alongside him, they began to see the results. A few small adjustments, and suddenly their range expanded by hundreds of miles. He taught not through lecture, but through example. He'd sit in the cockpit, hands steady on the controls, explaining each decision in calm, measured tones. Every engine has its own rhythm, he told them. You have to feel it, not fight it. They learned to balance throttle and manifold pressure, to trust the subtle language of gauges and vibrations. The change was immediate and profound. Missions once thought impossible became routine. In those humid, distant weeks, Lindbergh's lessons redefined air warfare. The impossible became achievable, not through new machines, but through new understanding. It was the marriage of science and instinct, the meeting point of experience and humility. And so, beneath the tropical sun, as P-38s roared off the runway and dwindled to silver dots against the horizon, a quiet transformation was underway. A man once silenced by politics had found his voice again, not in speeches or protest, but in the sound of engines running lean, efficient, alive. Outside the hut, evening settled over Hollandia. The air cooled. The jungle exhaled. And from somewhere down the runway came the fading echo of twin propellers, a rhythm steady and true, like the heartbeat of history itself. The 475th Fighter Group, known across the Pacific skies as Satan's Angels, was built around 3 squadrons, the 431st, 432nd, and 433rd. Each flew the newest P-38J Lightnings, their twin booms gleaming in the tropical sun like polished silver arrows. These models carried improved intercoolers and additional fuel tanks that gave them a reach unmatched by any other fighter in the Pacific theater. They were the sharpest blade in America's long-range arsenal. Yet even so, the blade had limits. On paper, the P-38 could range farther than any single-engine fighter in the region, but in practice, the math was cruel. Even with external drop tanks slung beneath the wings, missions to distant targets left precious little fuel for dogfights or unplanned detours. Pilots often returned with their gauges hovering near zero, engines coughing, hearts pounding, hoping the field appeared before the last drops were gone. A few never made it home at all, lost to bad weather or unexpected headwinds that pushed endurance just beyond reach. Those who did return often said the final minutes of flight were spent listening for silence, the kind that meant the tanks had run dry. When Charles Lindbergh appeared that humid afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald treated him politely, but with the distracted air of a man whose attention was fixed elsewhere, on the checkerboard spread across the table before him. But when Lindbergh mentioned that he had come at the request of General Hutchinson, commander of the 3rd Air Task Force, MacDonald's interest sharpened. The name carried weight. Hutchinson's word was not to be ignored. After a short exchange, MacDonald asked the question that would set history in motion. Would you like to fly a mission tomorrow? Lindbergh agreed at once. The flight was scheduled for dawn. Instead of returning to headquarters, McDonald suggested he stay the night with the unit. Less fuss, fewer delays. A spare cot was arranged beneath the palm thatch roof of the officers' quarters, and as Lindbergh unpacked, word began to ripple through the camp like electricity. Charles Lindbergh, the man who had crossed the Atlantic alone, was sleeping among them. The reactions were divided. Lieutenant John Perudry of the 433rd could hardly hide his excitement. For him, this was like meeting a living legend. Others were more guarded, exchanging doubtful glances. Some wondered what a 42-year-old civilian could possibly teach men who had been fighting and dying in the Pacific skies for years. Major Thomas McGuire, a lean, intense pilot already credited with 15 victories, said little, but his eyes narrowed in curiosity. Before the war was over, McGuire would become America's second highest scoring ace, yet even he wanted to see what the old man could really do. At 0530 hours on June 27, 1944, the airfield awoke beneath a curtain of steady tropical rain. The mountains of New Guinea were lost in gray mist, and puddles gathered between the rows of P-38s, standing like sentinels in the dawn. Lindbergh, dressed in khaki and calm as always, moved through pre-flight checks with the quiet precision of a man who trusted the ritual more than luck. By mid-morning, the weather began to lift, and at 10:30, the four Lightnings rolled down the runway in sequence, propellers flashing in the sun. McDonald led the flight toward Jeffman Island, a familiar target where enemy barges and airstrips had survived too many previous raids. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3, tucked neatly on McGuire's wing, while Captain Merrill Smith, a veteran with 8 confirmed kills, completed the formation. To McDonald's surprise, the newcomer's formation flying was flawless. Every turn, every throttle adjustment was exact, as if Lindbergh had been born inside the cockpit. The mission was simple: strafe an enemy barge near Kaibobo Bay, but even simple missions could turn deadly in an instant. The P-38s dropped low over the water, the salt spray streaking across their windshields. Tracer fire arced upward from the shoreline like sparks from a forge. Lindbergh's Lightning dove through it, guns hammering, striking the barge amidships. Within minutes, it was over. The 4 aircraft reformed and headed home, engines droning in perfect unison. Back at base, the mechanics noticed something peculiar. When the ground crews inspected Lindbergh's P-38, they saw that his fuel gauges told a different story. While the others had returned nearly empty, Lindbergh's tanks still held a generous reserve. At first, it seemed a fluke, but after several more missions, the pattern repeated. On July 1st, after a grueling 6.5-hour reconnaissance flight along the western shore of Gilving Bay, Lindbergh landed with 210 gallons of fuel remaining. The other pilots, flying the same route, rolled to a stop with their gauges trembling on empty. On July 3rd, the group escorted 16 B-25 bombers on a raid against Jeffman Island. After the bombing run, the P-38s went barge hunting again. Within an hour, 2 pilots had to break off and return, their fuel nearly gone. Lindbergh, meanwhile, still had ample reserves. McDonald noticed the discrepancy and decided it was time to confront it head-on. 2 days later, he called an impromptu meeting in the group's recreation hall, a rough structure with a palm thatch roof, dirt floor, and the smell of damp canvas in the air. A few bare bulbs cast harsh light on the faces of men who had seen too much sun and too little rest. A ping-pong table and a deck of cards served as the only recreation. Tonight, it would be their classroom. McDonald introduced the guest of honor formally. "Gentlemen, you all know who this man is. He's been flying with us these past days, and we've noticed he's been coming home with more fuel than any of you. Mr. Lindbergh has agreed to tell us how." The room fell quiet. Lindbergh stepped forward, hands loosely clasped behind his back, and began to speak, not as a lecturer, but as one pilot to another. His voice was steady, low, and deliberate, the tone of someone used to being doubted and letting results speak in his place. He explained that the standard cruise procedure taught to all P-38 pilots, 2,200 to 2,400 RPM, with the fuel mixture set to auto-rich, was needlessly wasteful. Good for power, he admitted, but terrible for endurance. The phrase hung in the humid air. Then he outlined his alternative. By reducing engine speed to 2,600 RPM, switching the mixture to auto-lean, and slightly increasing manifold pressure to around 30 inches of mercury to balance the loss of RPM, the Lightning could maintain effective cruise speed while burning far less fuel. He spoke with the precision of an engineer and the intuition of a craftsman. At these settings, he said, you'll be consuming about 70 gallons per hour, achieving roughly 2.6 miles per gallon. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. That means extending your range by nearly 400 miles. In other words, 9-hour missions. When he finished, the silence that followed was almost physical. Pilots shifted uneasily on the benches. The thought of 9 hours in a P-38 cockpit, cramped, sweltering, strapped atop a parachute and emergency raft, was almost unbearable. Even 7-hour missions already stretched the human body to its limits. 9 seemed like a sentence. But what troubled them more was his method. The combination of low RPM and high manifold pressure violated everything they had been taught. It was called running over square. Every flight instructor in America had warned that over-square operation would overheat the cylinders, cause detonation, and destroy the engines. Exceed manifold pressure by more than a few inches, they had been told, and you're gambling with your life. And here was a civilian, an outsider, suggesting they do exactly that. The room murmured with disbelief. A few men exchanged skeptical glances. One or two shook their heads outright. Someone muttered, "He'll blow a piston before he makes it home." But MacDonald, watching from the edge of the crowd, saw something others didn't. Lindbergh was not theorizing. He had flown these missions in combat, under fire, and his engines were running perfectly. So the colonel made a decision. "We'll test it," he said. "If it works, it works. If it doesn't, we'll know soon enough." Over the next week, pilots began cautiously experimenting with Lindbergh's technique. The first flights were short, designed as proof of concept. Pilots monitored every gauge as though the aircraft itself might protest. The engine sounded different, lower, deeper, a steady hum instead of a strained whine. But the needles on the temperature dials stayed where they should. Oil pressure was stable. Cylinder heads, the key indicator of danger, ran cooler than ever. Confidence grew. Gradually, the experiments extended to longer sorties, and with every flight, the evidence mounted. Fuel consumption dropped dramatically. Missions that had once demanded immediate return now allowed for lingering patrols, for broader coverage of enemy waters, for choices. Lindbergh had done more than teach fuel economy. He had given them back time, the most precious commodity of war. Time to scout, to think, to fight another pass before heading home. It changed everything. In the evenings, when the day's flying was done and the jungle insects began their rhythmic chorus, the men gathered outside the tents, speaking in low voices. Someone would mention how his fuel gauges looked healthier than ever. Another would say, half smiling, "Maybe the old man knows something after all." They began to realize that his calm precision was not arrogance. It was the weight of experience, the same kind of discipline that once carried him across an ocean alone. By the end of that week, skepticism had given way to respect. The hum of the Allison engines, running steady and cool at 1,600 RPM, became the new music of the 475th. The men learned that sometimes survival came not from pushing harder, but from listening, adjusting, and trusting that knowledge could be its own kind of courage. And on one still evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains of New Guinea, and the light turned the P-38s to silhouettes of silver and shadow, a mechanic paused beside Lindbergh's aircraft. He ran his hand along the smooth metal skin and listened to the quiet ticking of the cooling engines. The air was heavy, fragrant with oil and salt, and somewhere a single propeller blade turned once, slowly, like the second hand of history marking a new rhythm in the war. Flights that once forced pilots to count every drop of fuel, measuring distance and survival with anxious eyes on trembling gauges, now ended with comfort to spare. The P-38 Lightning, once confined to an operational radius of roughly 570 miles, was suddenly stretching to 700, then 750. Each new mission redrew the invisible map of what was possible. Pilots discovered they could fly to distant targets, once written off as unreachable, fight for 15 minutes in hostile skies, and still have the luxury of an hour's reserve fuel for the long flight home. It was nothing short of revolutionary, a quiet change that rippled through every mission plan, every calculation, every heart that once tightened when the fuel needle dipped into red. Skepticism, which had filled the recreation hall days earlier like static in the air, now melted away under the heat of results. One flight, then another, then a dozen more, all returning safely, all with fuel left in their tanks. Doubt turned into curiosity. Curiosity turned into conviction. Lindbergh flew regularly with the 475th now, his silver hair catching the tropical light as he climbed into his Lightning like any other man on the line. He taught not through lectures, but by example, through the language of precision, of motion, of proof. When he took to the radio, his call sign was simple and understated, Mr. Lindbergh. The pilots watched him closely, half in awe, half in disbelief. There was something almost unnatural in his composure. When he spoke of power and efficiency, he spoke not like an engineer, but like someone who understood the soul of the machine, the rhythm of metal and flame. He explained the logic behind the technique in plain terms that any flyer could grasp. Every aircraft engine, he said, was a conversation between pressure, fuel, and motion. Fuel burned to create pressure. Pressure turned pistons. Pistons created thrust. The art lay in balance, getting the most out of every drop without asking the machine to give more than it could. For years, they had been taught that high RPM and rich fuel mixtures meant safety, a cushion against I-Ching, detonation or engine failure. But that safety came at a cost, waste. Think of it like walking, Lindbergh would say. You can cover the same ground with long, steady strides instead of short, frantic ones. The distance is the same, but the effort is different. By reducing RPM, the engine spun slower, but by increasing manifold pressure, it pushed harder each time. The result was the same power, fewer revolutions, and far better efficiency. The key, he said, was not brute strength, but rhythm, letting the engine breathe instead of forcing it to labor. The lean mixture further improved that rhythm, giving just enough fuel for perfect combustion. It was, as he put it, the difference between gluttony and nourishment. The engines didn't suffer, because even though the settings looked over square on paper, the actual power output remained moderate. 30 inches of manifold pressure was a far cry from the 60-inch war emergency setting that stressed every bolt and bearing. The irony, Lindbergh explained with a faint smile, was that these lower settings actually reduced mechanical wear. Less speed meant less vibration. Fewer revolutions meant longer life. The technique wasn't dangerous, it was just unfamiliar. What the manuals had called unsafe was simply untested in the field, and he, more than anyone alive, had spent a lifetime testing the boundaries of fuel, air, and endurance. That expertise had been forged long before the Pacific. In 1927, when he crossed the Atlantic in the spirit of St. Louis, he learned that an aircraft's limits were not written in ink, but discovered in the air. Later, in the 1930s, while charting routes for Pan American Airways over the endless expanse of ocean, he had refined those lessons one careful flight at a time, thousands of hours experimenting with fuel, pressure, and power settings. He knew by instinct the sound of an engine running at its sweetest harmony, the note between strain and silence. The P-38 offered a unique gift for such experiments: 2 engines. To a lesser man, it might have been reassurance. To Lindbergh, it was opportunity. If one failed, the other would bring him home. That redundancy gave him freedom to explore what others wouldn't dare. And out here, above a Pacific that could swallow men whole, every pilot understood that the line between boldness and recklessness was drawn in fuel vapor. He calculated the risks with the same cool logic that had once carried him from New York to Paris. Allison, the manufacturer of the P-38's V-1710 engines, was shipping replacements and spare parts to the Pacific in generous supply. If one engine wore out sooner because of his technique, the mechanics could replace it. But if his methods worked, and they clearly did, the gain in operational range could decide missions, even battles. In war, that kind of advantage was priceless, and as it turned out, not a single P-38 engine failed from his methods. By late July 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control technique had spread like wildfire across the 5th Air Force. Pilots swapped numbers and notes over coffee. Crew chiefs compared logbooks. Word traveled faster than any official order could. Other squadrons wanted in. The commander of one unit reportedly told his men, "If Satan's Angels is saving fuel, we'd better learn how to do it too." Soon, Lindbergh was holding informal sessions with pilots from neighboring groups, patient and precise, chalk in hand, sketching graphs on crate tops, and answering every technical doubt with the calm of a man who had already proven the truth in the air. Then came July 28, 1944, a day that would etch his name, not just in record books, but in the memory of every pilot who flew with him. The mission was a bomber escort near the Saarinen region, flown with the 433rd Squadron. Lindbergh took his place as Blue 3 in a 4-ship formation over LPD Bay. Below them, the water shimmered like hammered glass. The air was steady, the kind of calm that always felt deceptive. They spotted movement first, a pair of Japanese aircraft, small and slow-moving against the horizon. Mitsubishi Ki-51, Sonya light bombers, used for reconnaissance and ground attack, limping back from a failed search mission. There were 2 of them, belonging to the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai. One was flown by Captain Saburo Shimada, the unit's commanding officer, the other by Sergeant Yokagi, his wingman. Outmatched in speed, firepower, and altitude, the Sonyas should have been easy prey. But combat, like the ocean, has moods of its own. Shimada, seasoned and determined, refused to die quietly. What began as a simple interception became a running, twisting battle over the blue expanse of the Pacific. When McDonald's flight arrived, P-38s from the 9th Fighter Squadron were already engaged. Yokogi's Sonya took hits from Lieutenant Wade Lewis's cannon fire, its left wing caught, streaming smoke and flame. The doomed aircraft tried to level off, but Lieutenant J.C. Haslip closed from behind, his tracers finding their mark. A moment later, the burning Sonya rolled and plunged into the sea, disappearing in a rising plume of white spray. But Shimada was still alive, and still fighting. For 30 minutes, he evaded and countered, throwing his plane through tight turns that seemed impossible for its size. His wings cut through humid air, vapor trails curling from the tips, as if the sky itself were boiling. P-38 pilots chased, firing bursts that stitched the air but failed to connect. The Japanese captain fought not for victory, but for defiance, a duel of spirit against inevitability. Captain Danforth Miller, McDonald's wingman, managed to bring Shimada briefly into his sights, firing a burst that passed just behind the tail. Then Shimada did something no one expected. Instead of continuing to evade, he turned directly toward the incoming aircraft. The move stunned everyone, watching. Lindbergh, flying level, saw the Sonya break from its evasive pattern and come directly at him. head on, closing fast, a blur of wings and motion. For a heartbeat, he didn't believe it. The two aircraft hurtled toward each other at a combined speed of nearly 500 miles per hour. Shimada held steady, either attempting a ramming attack or preparing for a head-on gun exchange. For Lindbergh, a man who had crossed oceans but never traded fire with another human being, time seemed to slow. His mind went silent. There was only instinct now, honed by decades in the air. He centered the Sonya's radial engine in his gun sight, pressed the trigger, and held it down. The P-38's nose erupted in fire and sound, one 20mm cannon, and the four 50 caliber machine guns blazing in perfect unison. 6 seconds of thunder, 6 seconds of light. He watched the rounds walk across the Sonya's fuselage, saw its propeller stutter, its smoke thicken. Still, Shimada came on. At the last possible moment, Lindbergh pulled up hard, feeling the crushing weights of gravity as his Lightning climbed clear by mere feet. Behind him, the Japanese bomber fell away, wounded beyond saving. Other P-38s fired as it spiraled downward, trailing smoke that stretched across the sea like ink spilled on blue glass. Then came the impact, a brief column of white spray, a widening circle of foam, and silence. Within seconds, the waves folded back over the wreckage, leaving only ripples. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were gone. Back at base, the debriefing was subdued. The pilots compared notes, reviewing gun cam footage and strike reports. Several had fired at the same target, McDonald, Miller, and Lindbergh among them, but everyone agreed on one point. It had been Lindbergh's head-on burst that crippled Shimada's plane, the hit that slowed the propeller and sealed its fate. There was no ceremony, no official record, just quiet acknowledgement among the men. For a civilian forbidden from wearing a uniform, who had come halfway across the world simply to observe, it was an extraordinary moment. Lindbergh had achieved what few could imagine. He had proven that knowledge, precision, and courage could coexist in the same man. That night, long after the engines had cooled and the sea mist crept over the field, the men of the 475th sat in the glow of a single lantern, talking in low voices. Somewhere in the darkness, a mechanic tested a throttle, and the distant hum of an Allison engine rose, steady and sure. The sound drifted through the camp like a heartbeat, a reminder that even in war, the rhythm of flight could still hold something profoundly human. The victory was never written into the 475th Fighter Group's official record. It couldn't be. Lindbergh was still, by every regulation and chain of command, a civilian. His participation in combat, though quietly tolerated, was already a gray line that no one wanted to examine too closely. To credit him, officially with a kill would have drawn too much light, and light, in wartime, could be dangerous. So, his moment over the Pacific remained an unspoken truth among the men who had seen it. 3 days later, that same man who had once crossed the Atlantic alone nearly lost his life above the islands of Palau. The mission that day was a routine fighter sweep, routine only by the cruel arithmetic of war. The P-38s took off into a sky that seemed calm enough, but over the endless shimmer of the Pacific, calm was always deceptive. They met the enemy halfway, Japanese Zeros, sleek and lethal, the Luftwaffe's equals in grace and danger. In the swirling chaos that followed, Lindbergh found himself locked in a turning fight, a dance of death that no one had taught him. The Zero pilot was skilled, patient, and dangerously close to ending the legend then and there. At the critical instant, a voice crackled through the radio. "Break right! Break right!" It was McDonald. The colonel dove in, his gun spitting brief, bright lines of defiance that tore the Japanese fighter off course. The moment passed as quickly as it had begun, but its shadow lingered. Headquarters heard of it within hours. Enough was enough, they decided. Lindbergh had proven his point, had done more than anyone could have expected of a man sent to observe. He had flown roughly 50 combat missions across the Pacific, about half of them in P-38s with the 475th. He had tested his theories, trained men in the air, and even survived combat that should have ended him. But now, the risk outweighed the reward. If the nation's most famous aviator were lost in combat as a civilian, the political storm back home would be catastrophic. So, on August 12, 1944, Charles Lindbergh left Hollandia for the long journey home. The men of the 475th came to see him off. There were no speeches, no brass bands, just pilots and mechanics standing in the soft morning light, hands in pockets, watching the man who had once seemed larger than life climb aboard a transport like any of them. They respected him, not for his name, not for his fame, but because he had earned it where it mattered. He had sweated with them in the cockpit heat, flown through tracer fire beside them, and taught them something that changed the way they fought. In that shared understanding, rank and reputation vanished. There was only the brotherhood of flyers. What Lindbergh left behind reached far beyond that dusty airstrip in New Guinea. By October 1944, his methods, his cruise control techniques, had spread through nearly every P-38 unit in the Pacific. Each group adjusted the exact numbers for their altitude, temperature, or load, but the core idea remained unchanged. Lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, leaner mixture. Efficiency born of trust in the machine. Those few adjustments reshaped the map of war. Targets that had once been safely beyond reach were now within striking distance. Japanese bases that had operated under the illusion of immunity suddenly found themselves under escorted attack. Bombers could now carry protection deep into enemy territory, their fighter cover no longer peeling away halfway home. Long-range sweeps could strike farther than ever imagined, deep into the Empire's defensive ring. Pilots from New Guinea were now flying missions of 950 miles, 9 hours in the air, 15 minutes of combat, and the long journey back with fuel to spare. This wasn't just a technical improvement, it was a strategic transformation. The math of war had changed. The range extension gave General MacArthur's advancing forces a new weapon: time. Each mile gained in air coverage meant one less day waiting for airfields to be built, one less convoy exposed at sea, one less island that had to be taken at enormous cost. The P-38, with its newfound endurance, became both sword and shield in the long push toward the Philippines. By the latter half of 1944, operations that might have required months were completed in weeks. Airfields once considered too remote now became viable bases. The tempo of war increased. Pilots who had once returned home on fumes now landed with a safe cushion of fuel, enough to weather sudden squalls or enemy pursuit. That margin, small as it seemed, saved lives. Weather no longer condemned men to vanish over the ocean. Those who took damage in combat could nurse their aircraft home, their gauges showing hope where once there had been empty despair. When MacArthur's forces finally landed on Leyte in October, it was the Lightning's long legs, made possible by Lindbergh's quiet mathematics, that kept the skies above the invasion clear. P-38s flew from bases in New Guinea and Morotai to provide fighter cover over distances that had been considered impossible only months before. The difference between arriving with no reserve and arriving with an hour of fuel could mean the difference between defending the beaches and merely arriving too late. Yet, even then, acceptance was not universal. Old habits die hard. Some commanders remained wary, their instincts bound to the training that had carried them this far. The idea of running engines over square, with manifold pressure higher than RPM, was heresy to some. Mechanics worried about engine wear. Instructors questioned its safety. But data speaks louder than doctrine. Units that adopted the technique saw no increase in mechanical failure. Their logs told the truth in gallons saved, in missions completed, in men returned. Skepticism faded, replaced by reluctant admiration. By the close of 1944, Lindbergh's methods had been officially absorbed into U.S. Army Air Force's doctrine. Technical bulletins were revised, new operating charts printed, pilot manuals rewritten to include lean of peak operation and the precise balance between manifold pressure and revolutions that Lindbergh had taught in the field. What had begun as a civilian's personal experiment had become a matter of military standard, a rare case where an outsider's quiet persistence reshaped an entire branch of air warfare. But behind the technical triumph lay something deeper, a man searching for redemption in the one language he had always understood, flight. Before the war, Lindbergh's name had been both revered and reviled. His passionate isolationism, his involvement with the America First Committee, and his public remarks about German aviation technology had cast a long and bitter shadow. To many in Washington, he was tainted by his pre-war stance, his neutrality seen as naivety, or worse. President Roosevelt himself had once compared him to those who sympathized with the Confederacy during the Civil War. For a time, the man who had once united America in admiration stood alone in its suspicion. But the Pacific theater was a world apart from politics. Out there, among coral runways and tropical storms, men were judged not by speeches, but by skill. The Marines and Army Air Force pilots who flew with him didn't care about committees or campaigns. They cared about results, about the man in the next cockpit when the tracers started flying. To them, Lindbergh wasn't a symbol or a controversy. He was a pilot who knew what he was doing, who could back up his words with precision and courage. Even Major Richard Bong, the Pacific's top ace with 40 confirmed victories, offered rare praise when asked about him by a United Press reporter. "Lindbergh was as hot a pilot as any of us," Bong said. "He'd have been out there knocking them down every day if General Kenny had let him." Coming from Bong, whose calm mastery in combat had become legend, that simple statement meant more than any headline or medal ever could. It was a quiet absolution, offered from one flyer to another. When Lindbergh returned home in August 1944, he didn't retreat from the war effort. Instead, he shifted back into the technical realm that had always been his strength. That October, he attended a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter performance at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland, where he flew captured Japanese aircraft, analyzing their flight characteristics with his usual methodical precision. His reports offered valuable insights into the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, and his consultations with United Aircraft and other manufacturers continued to refine operational tactics and engine management practices that shaped air combat through the war's final year. The numbers alone tell the story of what he accomplished. The P-38J Lightning carried 410 gallons of internal fuel, 2 90-gallon mains, 2 60-gallon reserves, and 2 55-gallon leading-edge tanks, with the option for external drop tanks that could push total capacity beyond 1,000 gallons. Under standard procedures, 2,200 RPM auto-rich mixture, the twin Allison V1710 engines burned through fuel at a rate that made range a constant constraint. Lindbergh's adjustments cut that consumption to roughly 70 gallons per hour, transforming endurance. The result was a 31% increase in combat radius, from roughly 570 miles to about 750. And when equipped with drop tanks and optimized cruise settings, the Lightning could stay aloft for nearly 9 hours, covering over 1,000 miles, enough to bridge the vast spaces of the Pacific and back. It was not an incremental improvement. It was a reinvention of what American fighters could do. That difference changed the shape of the war. The island-hopping campaign that carried MacArthur's forces from New Guinea toward the Philippines depended utterly on air superiority. Fighter range determined strategy, what could be bypassed, what had to be taken, and when. With Lindbergh's techniques, commanders had choices they had never had before. Islands once thought essential could be bypassed entirely, saving lives and months of fighting. Bombers could reach deeper, escort fighters could stay longer, and the pace of the Pacific campaign accelerated in ways even planners hadn't imagined. Some later historians, misunderstanding the timeline, mistakenly credited Lindbergh's innovations to earlier missions, like the famed 1943 interception that brought down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. But the truth is simpler and perhaps more profound. His legacy wasn't tied to one battle or one victory. It was measured in endurance, in how far men could fly, how much farther they could push their machines, and how many of them made it home. And so, in the end, the man who had once been America's loneliest flyer found meaning again, not in records or headlines, but in the quiet hum of engines running smooth and true somewhere above the Pacific. A whisper of balance, of precision, of redemption carried on the wind. The myth that Lindbergh had somehow influenced the famous 1943 long-range P-38 mission that intercepted Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport endures even today. It makes for a good story, but it simply isn't true. That mission, flown by the 339th Fighter Squadron out of Guadalcanal, pushed the Lightning's range to its absolute limits long before Lindbergh ever reached the Pacific. He would not arrive there for another year. What he contributed was not a single spectacular mission, but a revolution that made such range commonplace. He turned the extraordinary into the routine. And perhaps that, in the end, is the greater achievement. Because what Lindbergh accomplished was not only a matter of mathematics or mechanics, it was a deeply human triumph. He was 42 years old when he deployed to the Pacific. In that world of young men, pilots barely in their 20s hardened by endless sorties, he was the elder among them, flying combat missions shoulder to shoulder with those young enough to be his students. The demands were punishing, high G turns that left the body drained, the roar and vibration of twin engines for hours on end, the cramped cockpit pressing against every joint, the damp heat of tropical air seeping through the canopy. Every mission was a test of endurance, both mechanical and human. Yet Lindbergh never asked for special treatment. He slept in the same tents, flew the same missions, ate the same field rations that passed for meals. He stood in line like everyone else, quietly adjusting his flight helmet before dawn, checking the Lightning's propellers, glinting faintly in the first light. To the young lieutenants and captains who filled the 475th's ranks, that meant something. He wasn't a celebrity visiting for a photograph. He was a man willing to risk everything to prove what he believed. If he had stayed behind the safety of headquarters walls, delivering lectures about fuel mixtures and manifold pressures, his words would have vanished into the noise of war. Combat pilots didn't trust theorists. They trusted those who flew beside them when tracer rounds cut the sky. By taking off with them, by leading missions and returning safely, again and again, with more fuel in his tanks than anyone else, he earned a credibility that neither rank nor reputation could buy. The effect went far beyond technical acceptance. Lindbergh's presence challenged the unspoken boundary between the military and the civilian world. Until then, the front lines had belonged exclusively to those in uniform, to men forged by discipline and hierarchy. But modern war had become something different, an industrial storm driven as much by engineers and scientists as by soldiers. The complexity of aircraft, engines, and logistics demanded minds that existed outside the chain of command. Lindbergh proved that these civilians, if allowed to contribute, could sharpen the edge of war itself. His example changed attitudes in quiet but lasting ways. Commanders began listening more closely to technical representatives from Lockheed, Allison, and Pratt & Whitney. Engineers were invited into briefing rooms. Factory specialists were allowed to advise on maintenance and performance. The invisible wall between combat and design began to crumble. This new cooperation between users and creators accelerated the pace of innovation across the service, each improvement feeding the next, shortening the distance between concept and reality. And the machine that made all this possible, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, deserves its own moment in the light. With its twin booms in central nacelle, it looked like no other fighter of its time. A mechanical contradiction, elegant yet brutal, fast yet forgiving. Those twin Allison V1710 engines, so often criticized in Europe for temperamental behavior, thrived in the Pacific's altitudes when handled with care. Their superchargers, when properly tuned, sang in perfect harmony at low RPM. Lindbergh's mixture management techniques unlocked their potential, balancing pressure and temperature like a conductor coaxing music from metal. The Lightning's design made it the perfect laboratory for his ideas. The multiple fuel tanks, the transfer pumps, the clean aerodynamic lines, all allowed pilots to fine-tune their consumption with a precision that earlier aircraft had never permitted. And its twin-engine configuration offered a safety net. If one engine faltered during a long experimental flight, the other could still carry a pilot home. Over the endless expanse of the Pacific, where the horizon merged with the sky, and a single failure could mean oblivion, that redundancy was salvation. Even as newer fighters like the P-51 Mustang began to appear in Europe, offering greater speed and higher altitude performance, the P-38 remained indispensable in the Pacific. The Mustang was a thoroughbred, beautiful, fast, but delicate. The Lightning was something else, rugged, stable, built to endure. Its twin engines provided security over water, its heavy armament, 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon clustered in the nose, delivered crushing power, and its low to medium altitude agility fit perfectly with the island battles that defined the theater. And when flown with Lindbergh's precision, its range became almost mythic. Numbers tell part of the story, but not the feeling behind them. The 475th Fighter Group, flying P-38s exclusively, would go on to achieve 551 confirmed aerial victories, the highest total of any Lightning group in the war. Among their ranks flew Major Thomas Maguire, America's second highest scoring ace with 38 victories, a man who embodied the Lightning's lethal grace. Every one of those victories depended on the aircraft's blend of range, power, and reliability. And Lindbergh's contribution, the subtle mastery of efficiency, magnified all of it. Longer missions, deeper strikes, safer returns. A ripple of change spreading outward through thousands of sorties and hundreds of thousands of flight hours. Yet behind the triumph lay the uneasy truth about how it all happened. Officially, Lindbergh should never have been there. His pre-war isolationism had made him persona non grata in Washington. President Roosevelt himself had ensured he would never again wear the uniform of the Army Air Forces. But war has its own logic, and necessity often bends rules that politics tries to hold straight. The same government that barred him from service quietly allowed him to work as a technical representative, unofficial and unacknowledged, yet essential. It was an arrangement that today would never pass review, but it worked. The rigidity of institutions gave way for once to the clarity of results, and those results endured. The men who flew beside him in 1944 carried his lessons for the rest of their lives. When interviewed decades later, veterans of the 475th still recalled the calm, deliberate voice of the tall civilian, explaining mixture settings under the glare of bare bulbs in the mess hut. They remembered his insistence on demonstration, his patient corrections, his refusal to talk down to anyone. Colonel Warren Lewis of the 432nd Squadron could still recite the numbers from memory nearly 40 years later. 1600 RPM, 30 inches manifold, auto-lean mixture, 185 indicated. The details might have shifted between aircraft and missions, but the principle remained. The principle that knowledge, when tested and proven, transcends dogma. Charles Augustus Lindbergh's story did not end in the war. 3 decades later, on August 26, 1974, the man who had once flown across oceans slipped quietly from this world at his home in Kipahulu, Maui. He was 72. Just days before, He had left Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York, knowing his time was short. He returned to Hawaii, the place he loved most, to spend his final days listening to the sea. He was buried within hours of his passing, in a handmade coffin built by local ranch hands wearing their work clothes, laid to rest in a grave lined with lava rock and black beach pebbles beside the small Palapala Ho'omau church. Only 15 people stood beneath the sky that morning as he was lowered into the earth. His headstone is modest, a simple concrete slab bearing a line from Psalm 139. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. For a man who had spent his life chasing the horizon, there could be no more fitting farewell. In 1970, his wartime journals were published, offering the first unfiltered look into those months in the Pacific. Within their pages, he wrote of fatigue, of discovery, of the strange intimacy of danger, shared with strangers who became brothers. He described the smell of the sea in the cockpit, the rhythm of engines that seemed to echo his own heartbeat. Those entries revealed not the mythic lone eagle of the headlines, but a man still learning, still searching for balance between conscience and duty. The lessons he left behind reach far beyond aviation. He proved that technical mastery, when joined with humility and courage, can alter the course of events as profoundly as any weapon. That civilian expertise, when invited into the fold, strengthens the whole. That institutions, no matter how rigid, must sometimes yield to evidence. And above all, that true leadership is shown not through orders, but through example. Perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy is the reminder that no system, however advanced, is ever beyond improvement. Even at the height of war, when victory seemed to depend solely on production and power, one man's quiet precision showed that refinement could matter as much as force. The Pacific demanded endurance. Lindbergh gave it efficiency. He took machines already pushed to their limits and taught them to breathe differently, to stretch time and distance without strain. In that, his achievement mirrors something larger than aviation itself. The war was filled with moments where knowledge, rather than firepower, tilted the balance, where understanding an engine's heartbeat or the weight of a fuel gauge mattered more than sheer courage. The German prisoners of war who once stared at endless rows of American bombers learned a psychological lesson about material power. Lindbergh's comrades learned a different one, that mastery of detail, pursued with quiet conviction, can reshape an entire theater of war. And so the story of Charles Lindbergh in the Pacific ends not with the roar of combat, but with the soft hum of two engines running in perfect balance somewhere over the endless blue. Knowledge, applied with precision, and proven by courage. When the German prisoners of war finally returned home, many carried a realization that would linger for the rest of their lives, that prosperity, built on freedom and cooperation rather than conquest, could create abundance greater than any empire forged by force. Thousands of miles away in another corner of that same vast conflict, American fighter pilots carried a different kind of revelation home with them. They had learned from a man who was not a general or a politician, but a flyer who understood engines and air the way a sailor understands tides. From Charles Lindbergh, they learned that mastery, quiet, methodical, and deeply human, could change the very limits of what was possible. Those who flew the P-38 Lightning never forgot it. The aircraft itself was unlike anything else in the sky, a strange, beautiful creature with twin booms stretching behind a central nacelle, its shape instantly recognizable even from miles away. To the men who piloted it, the Lightning was both a machine and a companion, one that could be temperamental, stubborn, even dangerous if handled carelessly. Yet it had a soul of endurance. It could claw its way through weather that grounded others, cross stretches of ocean where failure meant oblivion, and still bring its pilot home on one good engine and a whisper of faith. Its silhouette against the Pacific sunset became an emblem of American air power, sleek, defiant, and utterly distinctive. But when those pilots spoke of 1944 and the long, grinding months that followed, they rarely spoke only of the aircraft. They remembered a quiet civilian who had walked into their world and, without rank or orders, changed how they thought about flying. They remembered the man who showed them that what they called impossible was only difficult, that the limits printed in manuals were not barriers, but starting lines. Lindbergh's lesson was simple yet profound. Understanding an aircraft, truly understanding it, listening to the rhythm of its engines, feeling its drag and lift as extensions of one's own heartbeat, could unlock performance no engineer's chart had ever promised. That was his true legacy in the Pacific, not the number of missions flown or the single enemy aircraft he brought down, but the knowledge he shared and the courage with which he proved it. He had come as an observer, a guest in a war he was not officially allowed to fight, but when he left, he was something more. He departed not as the famed aviator who had once crossed the Atlantic alone, but as a comrade, one who had sweated through the same flights, faced the same dangers, and earned the same respect as those half his age. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, knew precisely what he had given them. They flew farther than any Lightning pilots before them. They fought longer over distant islands, no longer glancing nervously at fuel gauges dipping into the red. They returned to base with enough reserve to circle for one last look at the fading light over the water. And each time they did, they carried with them the quiet genius of a man who had seen in numbers and gauges something others had missed, a harmony between power and endurance. Lindbergh's contribution may have seemed technical, even mundane, adjusting RPM, leaning mixture, balancing manifold pressure, but in truth, it represented one of the greatest practical innovations of the entire Pacific Air Campaign. His techniques multiplied the reach of the P-38 Lightning, extending its wings over territories once considered unreachable. They made long-range escort and reconnaissance missions viable, gave bombers protection they had never enjoyed, and allowed American air power to strike deep into the heart of Japanese defenses. But beyond the numbers and the miles gained, there was a subtler transformation, the pilot's growing awareness that mastery was not only about courage or aggression, it was about understanding. That understanding had not come from laboratories or corporate offices filled with blueprints. It came from one man's accumulated wisdom, built patiently over 17 years since that solitary night over the Atlantic in 1927, when the spirit of St. Louis had cut through darkness and fatigue toward the faint glow of Paris. The same precision that had once carried him across an ocean now carried squadrons across the Pacific. The same discipline that had measured every drop of fuel in that fragile monoplane now saved the lives of men flying machines armed for war. It is remarkable how principles can endure across decades and across contexts. The machines had changed. The single radial engine replaced by twin liquid-cooled Allisons, the open cockpit replaced by pressurized canopies, the wooden propeller replaced by gleaming aluminum blades, but the essence remained the same. Efficiency was still survival. Knowledge was still power. The air still rewarded those who treated it with respect. Lindbergh's mastery was both scientific and spiritual. He believed that an aircraft had its own logic, its own temperament, and that only by working with it, never against it, could a pilot truly unlock its potential. That belief became a philosophy, and for 6 intense weeks in the summer of 1944, he lived that philosophy among the men of the 475th. Day after day, mission after mission, he flew, measured, explained, and refined. In tents lit by flickering lamps, he spoke softly about manifold pressures and fuel ratios, translating equations into something human and practical. And those young pilots listened, first out of curiosity, then out of respect, and finally out of gratitude. From those few weeks grew a legacy that rippled outward through the entire Pacific theater. Pilots taught other pilots, units passed on the new methods, And within months, what had begun as an experiment became standard practice. The U.S. Army Air Forces incorporated the techniques into official doctrine. Training manuals were rewritten, and the range of the P-38 Lightning, the reach of its twin silver wings, expanded far beyond what even its designers had imagined. The transformation wasn't just about technology, it was about mindset. Lindbergh had shown them that the sky, vast as it was, could be conquered not through sheer force, but through understanding. That precision, not power, was the true key to mastery. And in a war so often defined by destruction, his contribution stood apart as something creative, an act of building rather than breaking. When those pilots looked back years later, they remembered the sound, the deep, even hum of engines running lean and steady, the vibration softer, the range longer. They remembered the calm that came from knowing they had an extra hour's fuel when the weather turned bad, or when the sea below was too far for comfort. They remembered that knowledge, freely given by a man with nothing to prove, had kept them alive. That, perhaps, is the most enduring part of Lindbergh's Pacific story. He did not come to fight for glory or redemption. He came to teach, and in teaching, he found a kind of redemption anyway. The men he flew with never forgot him. In their letters, in their journals, in their quiet recollections decades later, they spoke of him not as a legend, but as one of their own. For all his fame, Lindbergh's greatest triumph was invisible, the steady hands of hundreds of pilots, applying his lessons across endless skies, trusting the math, trusting the machine, trusting that knowledge could stretch the limits of endurance. That faith, passed from one to another, outlived the war itself. When the P-38 Lightnings were finally retired, their twin booms glinting for the last time under peacetime suns, their story had already entered history. And with them, somewhere woven into the hum of their engines, was the voice of the man who had taught them to fly farther than fear and closer to perfection. In the stillness that follows flight, when the engines fade and the sea below turns from blue to black, you can almost hear it, the whisper of understanding that once changed the rhythm of war.